He doesn't shake hands with people like you." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They landed in the room like a verdict already decided. And for a brief second, time hesitated, suspended between professionalism and something far more personal, something colder, something familiar. Darius Cole stood at the head of the polished conference table, his hands still extended, steady, patient, unshaken. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. His presence quiet, deliberate, controlled, the kind of presence that didn't need introductions. But today, no one offered one. Ethan Caldwell barely glanced at the hand before turning his body slightly, just enough to signal dismissal, without saying another word. A subtle shift. But in rooms like this, subtle was everything. A few executives exchanged glances. One of them let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, quickly disguised behind a sip of coffee. And just like that, the moment passed for everyone. Except the one man it was meant for. Darius slowly lowered his hand. Not rushed, not embarrassed, just precise, like he had done this before, like he had seen this before. And in truth, he had. Years ago in smaller rooms with cheaper tables and louder men who thought power meant volume. But this room was different. This was where decisions moved markets, where silence carried more weight than speeches, and still, somehow, the same old assumptions had found their way in. Darius took his seat. Without a word, placing his leather portfolio gently on the table, his eyes scanning the room once. Not in anger, not in challenge, but in recognition, as if he were taking inventory of something far more valuable than numbers. Ethan leaned forward, already reclaiming the attention he believed was his voice smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that filled space easily. "Let's stay focused. We have real stakeholders in this room," he said, not looking at Darius, not needing to. The implication was clear, and no one corrected it. No one questioned it. The meeting moved on. Slides flicked across the screen, projections, forecasts, strategies layered in confident language, and every time Darius opened his mouth slightly, just enough to enter the conversation, Ethan cut in, redirecting, reframing, repositioning the narrative without ever acknowledging the interruption, a performance disguised as leadership, and the room followed, because that's what rooms like this did. They followed what felt familiar, what looked the part, what sounded right, even when it wasn't. Across the table, a junior analyst, Emily Ross, shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking. Between Darius and Ethan, something about the exchange didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't quite name it yet. Not out loud. Not here. Darius remained still, composed, his expression unchanged, but behind that stillness, something had already begun to move. Not anger, not frustration, something far more dangerous, clarity, because moments like this were never just about a handshake. They were about assumptions, about who was seen and who was overlooked, about who held power and who was allowed to show it. And as the meeting carried on, as voices overlapped and decisions formed without him, Darius Cole did what he had always done in rooms that underestimated him. He watched, he listened, and most importantly, he remembered every word, every glance, every silence. Because in a room built on perception, the smallest act of disrespect could carry the largest consequence. And this time, the consequence had already been set in motion, long before anyone realized they were part of it. The room did not change its tone after that moment. It simply absorbed it and moved forward like nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, something subtle and irreversible. Darius Cole sat back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting loosely against the edge of the table, his posture relaxed, but intentional, his eyes no longer searching for entry into the conversation, but studying it, dissecting it piece by piece, like a system already revealing its flaws. Ethan Caldwell continued speaking with growing confidence, pacing the rhythm of the meeting as if he owned not just the agenda, but the outcome. His voice carried easily across the glass walls, outlining expansion plans, capital allocations, and projected returns. Numbers delivered with precision, but without question, because no one in the room thought to question him. Not today, not in front of someone they had already decided did not belong. Emily Ross glanced down at her notes, then back up at the screen, then finally toward Darius. There was something about his stillness that felt different, not passive, not disengaged, but deliberate, like he was waiting for something specific to reveal itself. She noticed the way he tilted his head slightly every time Ethan referenced leverage ratios or offshore exposure, almost as if he already knew where this was going before the rest of them even caught up. Ethan clicked to the next slide, a chart filled with sharp upward lines and bold projections. We are looking at a $2.4 billion position across diversified assets with aggressive upside if we maintain current momentum, he said with a faint smile, the kind that suggested certainty, the kind that made people stop asking questions. Darius finally spoke, his voice calm, low, and precise, cutting through the room without force. And what happens if the momentum shifts? The question was simple, almost casual, but it landed heavier than expected. Ethan paused for half a second, just enough to register the interruption before dismissing it with a light chuckle. It will not, he replied quickly. We have structured this to absorb volatility. A few heads nodded around the table. Agreement came easily when confidence was presented as fact. Darius nodded once as if accepting the answer, but his eyes did not leave Ethan. Structured by who? He asked. The room shifted slightly this time, not visibly, but in attention and focus, because now the questions were no longer hypothetical. Ethan straightened in his seat, his tone sharpening just enough to reassert control. My team built the framework, and it has been reviewed at every level, he said, this time looking directly at Darius for the first time, not with curiosity, but with challenge. Darius held the gaze for a moment, then leaned back again, the tension dissolving as quickly as it appeared. Of course, he said quietly, as if the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. Across the table, Emily felt it again, that shift, that subtle realignment of power that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge, because it did not announce itself, it did not raise its voice, it simply existed. Ethan moved on quickly, reclaiming the pace of the meeting, but now there was a slight edge to his delivery, a need to reinforce authority that had not been there before. Slides continued, numbers expanded, projections grew more ambitious, but the room no longer felt entirely his. And somewhere between the data points and the confident forecasts, Darius reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone, not hurried, not hidden, just a small, deliberate motion. His thumb hovered for a brief second before typing a single message: activate full exposure review. No punctuation, no explanation, just a directive sent into a system far larger than the room he was sitting in. He placed the phone back down, gently, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if the meeting was still just a meeting. But for the first time that morning, the outcome had already begun to move beyond the walls of that glass room, beyond the voices and the assumptions, beyond the man who believed he was still in control. The meeting continued, but it no longer felt like a discussion. It felt like a performance, one that Ethan Caldwell was determined to finish strong. His voice carried sharper, now more controlled, more deliberate, as if he sensed something shifting beneath the surface but refused to acknowledge it. As you can see, our liquidity position remains stable even under moderate stress scenarios, he said, pointing to the screen where green bars and upward curves told a story everyone wanted to believe. Darius Cole did not look at the screen. He was watching Ethan, not the data, not the projections, but the man presenting them, the confidence, the blind spots, the certainty that had never been tested in a room that pushed back. Emily Ross noticed it again, the disconnect between what was being shown and what was being observed. She glanced at Darius, then back at her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure if she should document what she was feeling, because it was not in the slides, it was in the silence between them. Ethan clicked again, moving faster, now stacking information before anyone could slow him down. We have diversified exposure across international markets with structured protections in place, he added, his tone tightening slightly. Darius leaned forward, just a fraction, enough to signal presence without interrupting the flow. Which markets? He asked. The question was simple, but it did not carry the tone of curiosity. It carried precision. Ethan hesitated for a split second, then answered, primarily European and Southeast Asian positions. Darius nodded slowly. And the currency hedges? He followed. Ethan's jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly. Covered, he replied quickly, but this time the word did not land as clean as before. It felt rehearsed, not confirmed. Across the table, one of the senior partners shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan, then away. The room had not turned yet, but it had started to listen differently. Darius leaned back again, his voice calm, almost conversational. Covered does not mean protected, he said quietly, not challenging, just stating. Ethan forced a small smile. We have managed this portfolio for over 18 months without incident, he responded, emphasizing the timeline. As if duration alone guaranteed stability, Darius's eyes did not move. Markets do not reward history, they respond to pressure, he said, and this time the room did not ignore it. Emily felt her chest tighten, slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because now she understood what she had been sensing since the beginning. This was not a disagreement, this was an exposure. Ethan clicked to the final slide faster than before. Bottom line, we are positioned for aggressive growth with controlled downside risk, he said, his voice firm, reclaiming the narrative again. But now there was something behind it, something defensive, something trying to outrun a question that had already been asked. Darius did not speak again. He simply nodded once, as if the presentation had reached its conclusion, as if everything that needed to be said had already been revealed. The meeting wrapped with polite acknowledgments, chairs shifting, laptops closing, the quiet shuffle of professionals returning to their routines. Ethan gathered his materials, quickly avoiding eye contact as he moved toward the door, already speaking to someone beside him about next steps, about expansion, about confidence that had not yet realized it was built on something fragile. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes drifting back to Darius, who was still in his chair, unmoving, composed as ever. But now there was something else, something final. He stood, slowly adjusting his jacket, his gaze steady as he looked around the room one last time, not seeking validation, not offering explanation, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. Then he walked out, without a word, leaving behind a room that still believed the meeting had ended when in reality it had only just begun. Somewhere far beyond their view, systems were already responding, algorithms recalculating exposures, positions being reviewed, thresholds being tested, and for the first time since that handshake was refused, the balance of power had shifted completely, just not in a way anyone in that room could see. Yet the hallway outside the conference room felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that followed decisions people believed were final. Ethan Caldwell walked ahead of the group, his stride confident, his phone already pressed to his ear, speaking in low, sharp tones about execution timelines and capital flow, as if nothing inside that room had challenged him, as if the questions had been minor interruptions instead of warnings. He passed by glass walls and polished floors reflecting the same image he had carried for years: control, certainty, dominance. Behind him, the rest of the executives dispersed into smaller conversations, nodding, agreeing, reinforcing the narrative that had just been presented, because it was easier to believe in confidence than to question it. Emily Ross stepped out last, her steps slower, her mind still replaying the exchange she had just witnessed, not the slides, not the numbers, but the pauses, the hesitations, the way Ethan's answers had shifted under pressure, and more than that, the way Darius Cole had never once raised his voice, yet somehow redirected the entire energy of the room without effort. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Darius at the far end of the corridor, already walking away alone. No assistant, no entourage, just a man moving with quiet certainty, as if he had already finished something no one else knew had even started. Inside the building, systems were moving in ways no one on that floor could see: data streams, updating risk models, recalibrating exposure levels across multiple markets, algorithms flagging inconsistencies that had been buried beneath confidence for months. The message Darius had sent was not dramatic, it did not need to be, it was precise. And in environments like this, precision carried more force than any argument. Far below, in a secure operations center, screens lit up one by one, analysts leaning forward as alerts began to surface: unusual leverage ratios, cross-market dependencies, liquidity thresholds closer than they should have been. One voice spoke quietly: "We are seeing concentrated risk clusters tied to Caldwell's positions." Another responded: "Initiate full review, confirm counterparty stability." There was no panic, only process, because this was not chaos, this was structure revealing itself. Ethan stepped into the elevator alone, finally, ending his call, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored walls. He adjusted his tie slightly, exhaling once, as if resetting the moment in his mind. He had controlled the room, he had delivered the narrative, he had maintained authority, and in his world that was what mattered. Perception was reality, and reality had just confirmed him, or at least that is what he believed. The elevator doors closed smoothly, carrying him down floor by floor, unaware that the very foundation beneath his confidence was already being tested across systems he did not control. Emily remained upstairs, standing still for a moment longer before turning toward her desk, her instincts unsettled not by what had happened, but by what had not been said. She opened her laptop again, Scanning through the data she had been given earlier, something about the numbers no longer aligned the way they had before, as if a hidden layer had just been exposed, and now she could not unsee it. Meanwhile, Darius exited the building, stepping into the open air, the city moving around him, unchanged, cars passing, people walking, unaware that somewhere within the invisible networks that powered their world a sequence had already begun. He did not check his phone. He did not rush. He simply paused for a brief second, looking out across the skyline, as if measuring something far beyond buildings and numbers, because for him, this was never about the meeting. It was about what the meeting revealed, and now that everything had been confirmed, the next phase was no longer a possibility. It was already in motion, and by the time anyone realized it, the outcome would not be something they could debate. It would be something they would have to face. By late afternoon, the building had returned to its usual rhythm, but beneath that polished surface, something was unraveling quietly, precisely, and without announcement. Ethan Caldwell sat in his corner office, overlooking the city skyline, his jacket off, sleeves slightly rolled as he scanned through reports on his screen, numbers that had always reinforced his control, his strategy, his reputation. His phone buzzed once, then again, short, sharp notifications stacking faster than he could process them. At first, he ignored them, assuming routine updates, market fluctuations, minor adjustments. But then one alert held longer than the others, margin threshold approaching. He frowned slightly, tapping into the dashboard. Pulling up his portfolio overview, the numbers refreshed once, then again, and something did not align. A position he knew by memory down to the decimal point showed a variant, small but out of pattern. He leaned forward, his posture tightening, fingers moving faster, now pulling up cross-market exposure charts, currency hedges, derivatives layered across regions. Everything that had once looked seamless now revealing small fractures, tiny inconsistencies that should not have existed. Across the floor in the operations center, voices remained calm, but their pace had shifted. Exposure levels are exceeding modeled tolerance, one analyst said, eyes locked on the screen. Another responded, confirm counterparty stability. We are seeing reaction across 3 regions. There was no panic, just acceleration, the system doing exactly what it was designed to do, respond to pressure. Ethan picked up his phone, dialing quickly. Run a full status check on my positions now, he said, his tone controlled but sharper than before. The voice on the other end paused just long enough to signal something was wrong. We are already reviewing it. There are some unexpected triggers activating across your portfolio. Ethan stood up, now pacing slowly across the room, his reflection flickering in the glass as the city moved outside, unaware. That is not possible. We built protections for this, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Back at her desk, Emily Ross stared at her screen. The data she had reopened no longer matched the confidence she had heard earlier. She cross-referenced the leverage ratios, the offshore positions, the currency dependencies, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. The structure was not stable. It was stretched, layered in a way that only worked if nothing moved, and now something had moved. She glanced toward the empty hallway where Darius had walked hours earlier, and a quiet realization settled in. This had not been sudden. It had been seen in advance. Outside the building, Darius Cole sat in the back of a town car, the interior quiet, the city lights beginning to shift as the afternoon faded into evening. His phone rested in his hand, a new message appearing, review confirmed, initiate phase 2. He read it once, then locked the screen, his expression unchanged. No satisfaction, no urgency, just acknowledgement, because this was never about reaction, it was about sequence. Back in the office, Ethan's screen refreshed again. This time, the numbers dropped faster, positions adjusting automatically, liquidity tightening as thresholds were crossed. His assistant knocked lightly on the door, stepping in with uncertainty. There are multiple calls coming in from the risk team. They are asking for immediate clarification. Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes fixed on the screen, watching something he had built begin to move without him. And for the first time that day, the certainty that had carried him through that meeting began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, because what he was seeing was not a mistake. It was a system responding, and somewhere within that response a decision had already been made, one that he had not been part of. The numbers did not stop. They accelerated, each refresh pulling Ethan Caldwell deeper into a reality he had not prepared for. The screen in front of him no longer reflected strategy. It reflected consequence. Positions that once held steady began to unwind automatically, lines of credit tightening, collateral thresholds recalculating in real time. His phone rang again. This time, he answered immediately. Explain what is happening, he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer effortless on the other end. The response came measured but firm. Multiple triggers have been activated across your leverage positions. The system is initiating protective liquidation protocols. Ethan stopped pacing, his hand tightening slightly around the phone. Protective for who? He asked, the question hanging heavier than intended. There was a brief pause before the answer came. For the firm. Across the floor, analysts moved with increased focus, screens filled with cascading data points, each alert confirming what the previous one had already suggested. This was not a fluctuation, this was structural exposure being corrected one layer at a time. Emily Ross stood up from her desk, now unable to remain still. She walked toward the glass partition overlooking the operations area, watching as teams coordinated in quiet urgency. No raised voices, no chaos, just execution. She had seen market shifts before, but this felt different. This felt targeted, not random, not external, but internal, as if the system had been waiting for permission to act, and that permission had just been given. Back in his office, Ethan pulled up deeper layers of his portfolio, searching for stability, something that would anchor the movement, but each layer revealed the same pattern. Dependencies, too tightly linked, positions too aggressively stacked. Hedges that assumed conditions that no longer held. He scrolled faster, now his confidence giving way to calculation. We need to pause this, he said into the phone. Suspend all automated actions until we assess the full impact. The response came without hesitation. We cannot do that. The protocols are already in motion and they are tied to executive-level authorization. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, the words settling in with quiet precision. Executive-level authorization, he repeated internally, not as a question, but as recognition, because he knew exactly what that meant, and more importantly, who had the authority to initiate it. His mind moved back to the conference room, to the questions that had seemed simple at the time, to the man who had asked them without raising his voice, without asserting his position, and suddenly the pattern aligned, not as theory, but as fact. Across the city, Darius Cole stepped out of the car, entering a private building with the same calm presence he had carried all day. He walked through the lobby unnoticed by most, acknowledged quietly by a few who understood exactly who he was and what he represented. His phone remained silent now because there was nothing left to initiate, only to observe. The sequence was already complete in the office. Ethan's screen refreshed again, this time more aggressively. Assets converting to cash, positions closing at market value, not at advantage, but at necessity. The number at the top of the screen shifted downward faster than he could justify. His assistant re-entered the room, her voice careful. The board is requesting your presence immediately. There is an emergency session being called. Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes still fixed on the data, watching control slip, not through error, but through design. And for the first time since that moment in the conference room, he understood this was never about a handshake. It was about access, about authority, about a level of power he had failed to recognize until it was already acting without him. The boardroom felt different from the moment Ethan Caldwell stepped inside, not louder, not more crowded, but heavier, as if the air itself had already reached a conclusion before he arrived. The long table was filled, every seat occupied, faces he knew well, but none of them carried the usual ease. No small talk, no polite acknowledgement, just quiet observation, waiting. He closed the door behind him. Slower than usual, his posture still upright, his expression controlled, but now sharpened by something new, awareness. At the far end of the table, Darius Cole sat already in place, hands folded calmly in front of him, his presence centered, not dominant, not forced, just undeniable. And for the first time that day, Ethan did not look past him. He looked directly at him and understood the distance between what he had assumed and what was real. The chairman cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We will begin immediately, he said, his voice measured but firm. A screen behind him lit up, displaying a series of rapidly changing figures, exposure charts, liquidity, flows, asset movements, all tied to one name: Ethan Caldwell. We are currently observing accelerated liquidation across your managed positions, the chairman continued. This is not external market pressure, this is internal protocol activation. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his voice steady but tighter than before. Then stop it, pause the system. We need time to reassess. The chairman did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted briefly toward Darius, then back to Ethan. The system cannot be paused once executive-level authorization has been confirmed, he said, and this time the room did not move. No one adjusted, no one spoke, because the meaning was already clear. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Who authorized it? He asked, even though the answer had already formed in his mind. The chairman turned fully, now gesturing with an open hand toward the far end of the table. The authorization came from controlling interest under Emergency Risk Clause 14. He said, and with that every eye in the room shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but completely, toward Darius Cole, who remained exactly as he had been composed, still untouched by the tension that had filled the room. Ethan followed their gaze slowly, the weight of realization settling in layer by layer, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change anything. He said quietly, not as an accusation, but as confirmation. Darius did not respond immediately. He simply held Ethan's gaze for a moment, long enough to let the silence do what words did not need to do. Then he spoke, his voice calm, even almost reflective. "I asked you a question earlier," he said. "What happens when the momentum shifts?" The room remained still, no interruptions, no resistance, just attention. Ethan exhaled slowly, the answer he had given now echoing back at him with a different meaning. "We built protections," he said under his breath. Darius nodded once. "You built assumptions," he replied, not harsh, not raised, just precise. "And you built them on a structure that required no one to challenge you." Ethan straightened slightly, his voice returning with effort. "That does not give you the right to dismantle everything without warning." Darius leaned forward just enough to shift the energy of the room. "I did not dismantle anything," he said. "I exposed what was already unstable." Another pause, another layer settling over the table. "And I did it before it reached a point where the damage would not be contained." The chairman spoke again. "At this stage, approximately $1.6 billion in assets have already been liquidated, with remaining positions in process." The numbers landed harder now because they were no longer projections, they were outcomes. Ethan's hand moved slightly against the table edge, not to steady himself, but to anchor something that was no longer their control, had shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through authority exercised at the exact moment it mattered. And as the room sat in that realization, one truth became impossible to ignore. The meeting from earlier had never been about presentation, it had been about exposure, and the consequence of that exposure was now unfolding in real time, with no path to reverse it. The room did not move after that statement. It held the weight of it like a structure, adjusting under pressure, not collapsing, but no longer standing the way it had before. Ethan Caldwell remained standing for a moment longer, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored to certainty. The numbers on the screen continued to shift behind him, updating in real time, each change a quiet confirmation that what had been set in motion could not be undone. "This level of action requires oversight," Ethan said. Finally, his voice controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now, not anger, but resistance, the kind that comes when control slips. Without permission, Darius Cole did not raise his voice, he did not lean further forward, he simply remained as he was, composed, centered. "It had oversight," he replied. "You just did not recognize it when it was in front of you." The words did not echo, they settled. The chairman glanced briefly at the screen again. "We are now at $1.9 billion in liquidated assets. Remaining positions are being evaluated for continuation or closure," he said, the update delivered with the same tone as any other report. But now every number carried consequence. Ethan's gaze flickered toward the display, then back to Darius, the connection no longer abstract, no longer distant. "You could have addressed this in the meeting," he said. "You could have raised concerns instead of triggering a full-scale response." Darius held his gaze steady. "I did raise concerns," he said calmly. "Dismissed them before they had weight." A subtle shift moved through the room, not visible in motion, but present in attention, because now the sequence was clear, not just what had happened, but when it had begun. Emily Ross sat at the far end of the table, her hands resting lightly on her notebook, her eyes moving between the two men. As the reality settled deeper, this was not escalation, this was alignment, cause-meeting effect in a way that could not be argued, only understood. Ethan took a slow breath, his voice lowering slightly. "This will have consequences beyond me," he said. "Markets will react, confidence will shift." Darius nodded, once acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. "That is why it was done now," he replied, "before instability turned into collapse." Another pause stretched across the table, the kind that did not need to be filled, because everything necessary had already been said. The chairman spoke again. "Final review indicates full liquidation will be completed within the next 90 minutes, pending no external interference." Ethan's hand moved again, this time resting flat against the table's surface, not gripping, not shaking, just present, as if grounding himself in a moment that had moved beyond negotiation. And after that, he asked quietly. The chairman did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted once more toward Darius, not for instruction, but for acknowledgement. Darius remained still for a second longer, then spoke. After that, the structure resets, he said, and the firm moves forward without the risk that was overlooked. The words were not framed as punishment, they were framed as outcome, and that distinction settled deeper than anything else in the room. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition of something final, something that could not be repositioned or reframed. The authority in the room had not changed suddenly. It had been there all along, simply unrecognized until the moment it acted. And now, as the numbers behind him continued to update, approaching their conclusion, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was resolved, because the question of who held control had already been answered, not through words, not through titles, but through action taken at the exact moment it mattered most. The final numbers arrived without announcement, no sound, no signal, just a quiet shift on the screen that marked the end of something that had once felt untouchable. 2.4 billion fully liquidated. The chairman set his voice steady, as if reading a routine update, but the words carried a finality that settled into every corner of the room. No one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to question. The process had completed exactly as designed. Ethan Caldwell remained standing, his eyes fixed on the display, not searching for reversal anymore, not expecting correction, just observing the result of a system that had moved beyond him. His reflection, faint in the dark glass behind the numbers, looked different, now not broken, not defeated, just stripped of the certainty that had defined him for so long. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. So that is it, he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but the room heard it anyway. Darius Cole did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to hold for a moment longer, because silence in rooms like this was not empty, it was confirmation. He then leaned back slightly, his voice calm, measured. That is the outcome, he said, not emphasizing the loss, not repeating the number, just stating what was already clear. Ethan turned his head toward him fully, now his expression no longer guarded, but searching. You made your decision the moment you walked into that meeting, he said. Darius met his gaze without hesitation. No, he replied. I made it the moment I saw how the system responded to you. The distinction lingered heavier than any accusation, because it was not personal, it was structural. Across the table, Emily Ross felt the shift settle completely. What had once been tension was now clarity, the kind that does not leave room for interpretation. The chairman closed the file in front of him. Effective immediately, all authority tied to those positions is reassigned. Risk controls will be restructured under new oversight, he said, his tone unchanged, but the implications unmistakable. Ethan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing left to challenge. Every argument had already been answered, not with debate, but with execution. He reached for the back of his chair, then paused, his hand resting there for a brief second, as if marking the end of something only he could fully understand before letting go. Darius remained seated, watching him, not with triumph, not with judgment, but with the same steady composure he had carried from the beginning. Because for him, this was never about winning, it was about alignment, about ensuring that what was built could withstand what was real. Ethan straightened his jacket instinctively, the gesture automatic, a habit of control. Even as control had shifted completely, he looked around the room one last time at faces that had once followed his lead, now quiet, now recalibrating their understanding of where authority truly lived. Then his gaze returned to Darius, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no dismissal, no assumption, just recognition. I underestimated you, he said, the words simple but unguarded. Darius did not react immediately. He held the moment just long enough for it to settle before responding. You did not underestimate me, he said calmly. You misread the room. The correction was subtle but absolute, and as it landed, the last illusion of control dissolved, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely, because in that room at that moment the truth was no longer something to debate, it was something that had already acted. And as Ethan turned toward the door to leave the space he had once commanded, the quiet that followed was not uncertainty, it was resolution, the kind that remains long after the Numbers stop moving and the decisions are no longer reversible. The door closed behind Ethan Caldwell with a quiet click that echoed longer than it should have, the kind of sound that marked not just an exit, but a transition. The room remained still for a moment after he left, as if recalibrating itself to a new center of gravity. No one rushed to speak, no one reached for their phone, because the shift that had just taken place demanded recognition before movement. The chairman exhaled slowly, then gathered the documents in front of him, not out of urgency, but out of routine. "We proceed from here," he said, his voice steady, returning the room to function, but not to what it had been before. Across the table, Darius Cole remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence still anchoring the space. Without effort, he did not look at the door, he did not follow Ethan's exit with his eyes, because for him the moment had already concluded. Before Ethan stood up, Emily Ross glanced toward Darius, then back to the screen, now cleared of numbers. The absence of data felt almost louder than the cascade that had filled it minutes earlier. She realized then that what she had witnessed was not just a financial correction, it was a demonstration of something deeper, something structural, something that existed beyond titles and presentations. The chairman turned slightly toward Darius. "We will need to restructure oversight immediately. Risk exposure protocols will be reassigned under your direction," he said, the statement formal but carrying an underlying acknowledgement of authority. Darius nodded once, not as acceptance, but as continuation. "Begin with the regional dependencies and unwind any remaining cross-leverage." "Exposure," he said, his tone calm, precise, the same tone he had used from the beginning. No change, no escalation, just direction. The room responded differently, now not with passive agreement, but with focused attention, because the source of authority was no longer assumed. It had been revealed one by one. Laptops reopened, notes resumed, but the energy had shifted from confidence to clarity. Across the table, one of the senior partners leaned forward slightly. "We did not see it early enough," he admitted. The words quiet but honest. Darius's gaze moved briefly toward him. "You saw what you were used to seeing," he replied, "not what was actually there." The distinction settled into the room, deeper than any critique, because it was not directed at one person, it was directed at a pattern. Emily felt it fully now, the realization that the meeting from earlier had not been about exclusion, it had been about exposure, not of a person, but of a system that responded to perception instead of truth. And now that system had been forced to confront itself. Outside in the hallway, Ethan walked alone, his pace slower, now not from hesitation, but from processing. His phone remained silent for the first time that day. No new alerts, no incoming calls, because there was nothing left to update. The process had completed. He passed by familiar faces, some looked up, some looked away. None of them spoke, not out of judgment, but out of uncertainty, because the narrative they had followed no longer held. He stepped into the elevator again, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of himself that no longer matched the position he had carried just hours before. He adjusted his tie once more, a habit, not a necessity, and as the doors closed, the building continued to move above and below him, unchanged in structure, but altered in understanding. Back in the boardroom, Darius stood, at last, adjusting his jacket, with the same quiet precision he had shown all day. His eyes moved once across the room, not seeking approval, not offering explanation, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. Then he spoke one final time before stepping away. "Control is not what you say in a room," he said calmly. "It is what still moves when you leave it." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a space that now understood exactly what that meant. The building did not feel the same the next morning, even though nothing about it had physically changed. The glass walls still reflected the skyline, the elevators still moved with quiet efficiency, the desks were still arranged in the same precise order, but something underneath all of it had shifted, something less visible, but far more permanent. Emily Ross noticed it the moment she stepped onto the floor. Conversations were lower, more deliberate. People looked at their screens longer before speaking. Decisions that used to come quickly now carried a pause, as if every assumption had to pass through a new filter before it was allowed to exist. She walked to her desk, placing her bag down slowly, her eyes scanning the space that had once felt predictable, and realizing that predictability had been replaced by awareness. On her screen, a new directive had already been issued, risk protocols updated, oversight reassigned, and at the top of the document one name appeared with quiet authority: Darius Cole. It was not highlighted, it was not emphasized, it did not need to be. The presence alone was enough. Across the floor, a senior partner stood speaking with two analysts, his tone measured, his words careful. "We are not here to repeat what happened yesterday," he said. "We are here to understand why we did not see it sooner." The analyst nodded, not defensively, but thoughtfully, because for the first time, the conversation was not about maintaining position, it was about recalibrating perception. Emily opened her laptop, pulling up the same data she had reviewed the day before, but now it read differently, not because the numbers had changed, but because she could see the gaps now, the assumptions layered into the structure, the quiet dependencies that had gone unchallenged simply because they were familiar. And as she worked through each line, she realized something deeper. This was not just a correction of a portfolio, it was a correction of a mindset. In another part of the city, Ethan Caldwell sat alone in a private office smaller than the one he had occupied before, but still polished, still professional. The transition had been quiet, handled without announcement, without spectacle. His phone rested on the desk in front of him, no longer filled with alerts, no longer driving his decisions, just silent. He looked at it for a moment, then away. His reflection in the window beside him no longer matched the identity he had carried into that meeting, but it was not diminished, it was clearer, stripped of the assumptions that had once defined his authority. He leaned back slightly, his mind replaying the sequence, not the loss, not the numbers, but the moment. It had all begun. The hand extended, the choice made, the signal ignored, and for the first time, he understood that what he had dismissed as insignificant had been the most important moment of all. Back at the firm, Darius Cole moved through the building without announcement, without escort, his presence known, but not broadcast. He stepped into a smaller conference room where a new group was already waiting, documents prepared, screens active, the work continuing without interruption, because for him there was no aftermath, only continuation. He took his seat, reviewing the information in front of him with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. One of the executives across from him hesitated briefly before speaking. "We have adjusted the exposure models based on yesterday's events," he said. Darius looked up, once his gaze steady. "Do not adjust them based on events," he replied. "Build them based on reality, so events do not become surprises." The room absorbed the statement not as instruction, but as principle, and as the day moved forward, the firm did not return to what it had been. It moved into something more aware, more deliberate, more grounded in truth than assumption, because the lesson had not been taught through words, it had been demonstrated through action, and that kind of lesson does not fade, it stays embedded in every decision that follows, shaping not just what is done but how it is seen. And in that shift, the real change had already taken place long before anyone had time to name it. By the end of the week, the firm no longer spoke about what had happened as an incident. It had already become a reference point, something unspoken but understood, woven into the way decisions were made and conversations were held. The language had changed, not in volume, but in precision. Assumptions were no longer left unchallenged, projections were no longer accepted without examination, and the quiet confidence that once filled the rooms had been replaced by something more grounded, something earned. Emily Ross felt it in every meeting she attended now, the pauses before answers, the questions that went one layer deeper than before, the willingness to say, "I do not know," instead of pretending to know. She sat in a strategy session reviewing new models when one of the senior analysts hesitated over a projection. "It aligns with historical performance," he said, then paused as if hearing his own words differently. "But that does not mean it holds under pressure," he added. The room did not rush past it. They stayed there examining the statement until it revealed what it needed to reveal, because now they understood that pressure was not an exception, it was a certainty. Across the table, Darius Cole listened without interruption, his presence unchanged, his approach consistent. He did not dominate the conversation, he directed it through attention, through the kind of silence that required others to think more clearly before they spoke. When he finally responded, it was not to correct, but to refine. "History is a reference, not a guarantee," he said calmly. "Build from what is true now, not from what felt safe before." The words settled into the room not as instruction, but as standard. Outside the firm, the market had already absorbed the shift. The liquidation had been processed, the positions redistributed, the ripple contained before it could expand into something larger. Analysts across the industry noted the precision of the move, the timing, the containment, but they did not see what had caused it, not fully, because what triggered it was not visible in data, it was visible in perception, in a moment that most would have overlooked in another office across the city. Ethan Caldwell reviewed documents quietly, his pace slower, his focus sharper. He was no longer reacting to systems, he was studying them, tracing the points where assumption had replaced awareness where confidence had overridden scrutiny. There was no anger in the process, no attempt to reclaim what had been lost, only a steady examination of what had been misunderstood. He paused at one section, then leaned back slightly, his mind returning once more to that moment, the extended hand, the decision to ignore it, and the realization that followed not immediately, but inevitably, that power had been present long before it acted, and he had chosen not to see it back at the firm as. The day moved toward evening. Darius stood near the window, overlooking the city, the same skyline, the same movement, the same rhythm, but now aligned with a structure that had been tested and corrected. He did not reflect on the numbers, he did not revisit the meeting, because for him the significance was not in the outcome, it was in the clarity it created. One of the executives approached him cautiously. "Everything is stable now," he said. Darius nodded, once his gaze still on the horizon. "Stability is not the goal," he replied quietly. "Understanding is." The executive paused, then nodded in return, the distinction clear, because stability can be temporary, but understanding changes everything. And as the lights of the city began to come on one by one, the firm continued forward, not defined by what had happened, but shaped by what had been revealed, a system no longer driven by assumption, but guided by awareness. And in that shift, the real power was no longer hidden, it was understood by those who had learned to recognize it before it needed to act. The story did not end in that boardroom, and it did not end in the numbers that had already settled into history. It continued in the quiet moments that followed, in the decisions that no one announced, but everyone adjusted to, in the way people entered rooms now, not just with confidence, but with awareness, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in structure, but in perception. Darius Cole stood once more in the same conference room days later, the same table, the same glass walls, the same city stretching beyond it, but the energy inside had changed completely. There was no longer a need to prove anything, no need to reveal authority, because it had already been established, not through words, not through titles, but through action that could not be ignored. Across the table, new strategies were being discussed, new frameworks built not on assumption, but on tested understanding. Voices were steady, but thoughtful, each statement carrying weight, because now every person in that room understood that what was overlooked could become what defined everything. Emily Ross sat among them, no longer uncertain, no longer observing from the edges. She contributed clearly, her voice measured, her questions sharper, because she had learned what mattered, not just what was presented, but what was beneath it. Darius listened, as he always did, allowing the room to move before he spoke. And when he did, it was not to dominate, but to align. "Power is not something you announce," he said calmly. "It is something people recognize when it acts without asking permission." The words settled into the space, not as a lesson, but as a truth already proven. No one challenged it, because no one could. Ethan Caldwell walked through a different building that same morning, not as the man he had been, but not less either, just changed, his pace slower, his decisions more deliberate. He paused outside a conference room before entering. This time, when someone extended their hand to greet him, he did not hesitate. He met it firmly, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, because now he knew that moments like that were never small. They were signals, and ignoring them did not erase them. It revealed something about you that could not be taken back. Back in the original boardroom, Darius gathered his materials, preparing to leave. Once again, his movements the same controlled, precise rhythm that had defined him from the beginning. One of the executives spoke before he reached the door. "You could have handled it differently," he said, not as criticism, but as reflection. Darius paused for a brief second, then turned slightly, his expression calm, his voice even. "I did handle it differently," he replied. "I handled it before it became something no one could control." The distinction was clear, and it stayed with them long after he left the room, because what had happened was not about punishment. It was about exposure, not of a person, but of a system that had relied too heavily on perception and not enough on truth. And as the firm continued forward, stronger, more aware, more aligned with reality, the final understanding settled in quietly, but permanently. Respect is not about a gesture, it is about recognition. And when recognition fails, reality will correct it, not loudly, not emotionally, but completely. And by the time that correction arrives, it is no longer a question of what should have been done. It is a reminder of what was ignored when it mattered most.